Hey, today we're going to be reading a book titled Who Was Michael Jackson? About the great life of the pop legend. Okay, so let's start with chapter 1. Chapter 1, Small House, Big Dreams. Michael Joseph Jackson was born in Gary, Indiana on August 29, 1958. The Jackson house was tiny and already crowded. Michael had four older brothers and two sisters. Maureen, called Robbie, was the oldest. Next came Jackie, then Tito, Jermaine, Latoya, and Marlon. A few years after Michael was born, Randy came along. Janet Jackson was the baby of the family, born 8 years after Michael. And Robbie is also known as Reby, but the book kind of messed the name up. It's Reby Jackson. Anywho, Michael's mother, Catherine, worked part-time at a Sears department store. His father, Joseph, worked at a local steel mill. Joe Jackson earned only $30 a day. To make extra money, he had a small band called the Falcons. They played in local bars and clubs around Indiana. Joe played guitar, and the band practiced in the Jackson small house. Both of Michael's parents had always loved music. His mother sang and played the clarinet and piano. Music was a big part of family life. Joe Jackson was a very strict father. He had lots of rules. None of the kids were allowed to touch his guitar ever. He kept it in a closet so they wouldn't be tempted to play it when he wasn't home. One day, Tito, Jackie, and Jermaine sneaked into the closet and took the guitar to Tito's room. Michael and his brothers watched as Tito figured out how to play chords. Tito had been studying his father very carefully. Little by little, Tito taught himself how to play. Catherine knew he was sneaking the guitar out, but she didn't tell her husband. She knew how mad he would be. Then one day, one of the strings on the guitar broke. Tito couldn't fix it, so he just put the guitar back in the closet and hoped his father wouldn't find out. Of course, Joe saw the broken string. All the boys were terrified because their father could be so mean. Michael said that Joe hit the kids when they did something wrong, but this time Catherine spoke up. She told Joe that the boys were good singers and that Tito could really play. Joe handed Tito the guitar. "Let me see what you can do," he said. As soon as Joe saw that his sons had talent, he wasn't angry. He brought home a shiny red guitar for Tito. Everyone in the family got music lessons, either at school or after school. Pretty soon, Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, Marlon, and Michael formed a band. They would become the Jackson 5. At first, Jermaine was the lead singer. Michael played the bongo drums, but it didn't take long for everyone to realize that Michael was the real star. He sang with so much feeling. When Michael entered a talent contest at school, his teachers cried at the sound of his beautiful voice. As time went by, Joe Jackson decided to put everything into his son's music career. The family didn't have much money, but Joe spent all they had on musical instruments. The Jackson boys had to rehearse every single day after school. There was no time to go outside or play. If anyone made a mistake while rehearsing, Joe punished them. Sometimes he hit them with his belt. Michael didn't make many mistakes singing, but one time he was late for band practice. Sometimes he broke the rules around the house too. Joe punished him for those things. When Joe hit Michael, sometimes Michael fought back. He would try to punch his father. Once he threw a shoe at him. That made Joe madder still, and he beat Michael a little bit more. Michael hated the way his father treated him, but he loved singing and dancing. He was happy when he was performing. When the band was ready, Joe got them a job at the local nightclub called Mr. Lucky's. Michael was only 6 years old at the time. By the time he was 8 years old, he was working 6 nights a week. The Jackson 5 had to play 5 shows every night. Sometimes they played in bars and nightclubs. I could imagine that, 8 years old playing in the bar. No matter how many times Joe tried, He couldn't get Motown to pay attention to the Jackson 5. Finally, Joe decided that Motown would have to notice them if they won the biggest talent contest of all time at the Apollo Theater in New York City. The Apollo is a famous theater in Harlem and an African American neighborhood. All the singers Michael loved had performed at the Apollo. People like James Brown and Stevie Wonder. A talent contest had been held there every Wednesday night for years. So in the summer of 1967, when Michael was 9 years old, Joe put all 5 of his boys into the family's VW bus and drove to New York City. Next stop, the Apollo. Michael was dazzled by the huge, fancy theater. He even loved the microphone. It rose right up out of the floor. Part of the tree trunk was near the stage. It was supposed to be good luck to rub the tree before going on stage. So of course, that was Michael and his brothers did. But the Jackson 5 had something better than luck. They had talent. They won the talent show. Now with Motown called, when they got home, Joe Jackson made a new rule. Phone calls could never last more than 5 minutes. Joe didn't want the line to be busy when Motown tried to reach them. For months, they didn't hear from Motown. So Joe decided to accept an offer from a local record company called Steeltown. It was just a small studio in Gary, Indiana, but they recorded the first Jackson 5 song. It was called Big Boy. Radio stations played it, and Joe sold lots of copies of it. But the Jackson 5 weren't going to get famous that way. Finally, in July 1968, the call from Motown came. Michael and his brothers piled into the VW bus and drove to Detroit. They were going to sing for the head of the record company, Barry Gordy. If he liked them, they'd get a record deal. As soon as Barry Gordy heard the Jackson sing, he knew what a superstar Michael could be. He told them, "I'm going to make you kids the biggest things in the world." He promised that their first record would be #1 on the music charts. Michael Jackson was only 10 years old, but he was on his way to become a legend. Okay, so that was chapter 1 of the Michael Jackson story. Some of the things that we need to remember about Michael Jackson. He was young when he first started. People always remember the Michael Jackson that we grew to love, but it's always remember when he first started as a 5-year-old little boy dancing and performing with his brothers in the club. So, to become a legend, you have to start off small. So a lot of people don't realize that they came from Gary, Indiana. They had humble beginnings. They didn't have really no money. And although their father was strict, he saw talent in them and he put work on them. So it's one of those things that is always good to remember. If you put the work in, you can become whatever your mind set out to be. And one last thing about the chapter that I think is very, very important is the Apollo. The Apollo is where a lot of people got their breaks. If you remember in the chapter, it talked about Diana Ross went there, Stevie Wonder went there. They could have went deeper into Ray Charles being there, the Four Tops, the Temptations. A lot of Motown's biggest acts started at the Apollo. You have to rub the tree trunk to get the good luck, but Michael Jackson and his brothers had this amazing talent. So we will be back to chapter 2 where we see where this legend grow from there. Chapter 2, Southern California. In 1969, Barry Gordy moved his Motown offices to Los Angeles, California, and the Jackson 5 moved with him. Gordy wanted them to live in California so they could record music there. Joe and Catherine Jackson were still back in Indiana. They were closing up their house so they could move to LA too. For a while, Michael lived part-time with Barry Gordy. The rest of the time, he lived down the street with a neighbor. The neighbor was a famous singer named Diana Ross. Diana Ross was the star of a Motown group called the Supremes. She taught Michael about the art and music. She took him to museums and taught him how to draw. Michael loved Diana Ross. Living with her was one of the most special times in his life. He loved California too. It was almost always sunny outside. He couldn't believe there were oranges on the trees. He and his brothers went to Disneyland. Pretty soon, Barry Gordon brought the Jackson Boys into his new recording studio. He had a song for them. It was called I Want You Back. Barry Gordon made the Boys record it over and over again. For weeks, Michael listened to every word Barry Gordon said. Little by little, Michael was learning all about the music business, and he was learning from one of the best. Barry Gordon turned the Jackson 5 into pop stars. He gave them new outfits and new hairstyles. He had someone teach the boys how to answer questions from reporters. They were tested on the answers. They were given lessons in table manners. Of course, that was easy for Michael and his brothers. Their mothers had insisted on good manners all their lives. When I Want You Back came out in November 1979, it sold 2 million copies in 6 weeks. It was #1 hit, just as Barry Gordon had promised. Their next 3 singles were #1 hits too. The Jackson 5 were stars, and Michael Jackson was the most famous one in the group. They did television shows with Diana Ross. They signed autographs. They went on the Ed Sullivan Show, a famous Sunday night TV show. It was the same show where the Beatles had performed. Concerts in huge arenas like Madison Square Garden in New York. Mobs of fans, screaming girls crowded around Michael whenever he went. Michael loved performing. He was never happier than when he was on stage, but he didn't like being crushed by fans. Sometimes girls scratched his face by accident. It was scary. To avoid the crowds of fans, Michael and his brothers hid in their hotel room most of the time. They didn't have much freedom, but they did have a lot of fun together. They made fake phone calls, then they giggled and hung up. They ordered room service meals for other people's rooms. They held races in the hallways and had pillow fights. Michael loved to play pranks and practical jokes. His brothers did too. Sometimes they dropped water balloons on people from the hotel windows. The Jackson 5 was silly. Now the Jacksons were rich enough to buy their own fancy house in California. Joe and Catherine bought a house not far from Hollywood. The whole family lived there together for many years. His early teen years were good times for Michael. He was still working non-stop, but at least he was having some fun in his time off. But as Michael got older, he got hit with all the problems that teenagers face. Except he wasn't like other teenagers. He was a famous singer. It was a lot harder to grow up being Michael Jackson, rich, famous, and with everyone watching all the time. That was chapter 2 of the Michael Jackson story. Some of the highlights of chapter 2 was when the Jackson 5 got their deal with Motown. This is one of the biggest moments of any music person's career, is getting a record deal. Getting a record deal means bigger exposure, more money, and being able to move your parents out of the ghettos of where you grew up at. Michael Jackson and them come from humble beginnings, so to get $1 million record deals at that time when you're a teenager is a big deal. Moving to California was a big move. Some people have said over the years that this was probably one of the biggest mistakes that the Jacksons made, was moving to California. They got a chance to get exposed to the Hollywood life. Sometimes coming from where you come from, it's like better to stay where you at, because you don't get yourself involved with all the things outside in the open. So, Gary, Indiana probably doesn't seem as big and famous as Hollywood, but you're safe in the confines of your own home. Michael Jackson also became a star, a bigger star, I should say, in this chapter. He became a teenager. As you can see, he loved his family life. He was able to still be with his brothers. He really didn't notice how big he was. But in chapter 3, you will get a chance to see the growth of Michael Jackson becoming his own man, stepping out on his own. And one last thing, never forget how important Diana Ross was to Michael Jackson. I'm sure this is going to come up again later in the book. Diana Ross became like a godmother to Michael Jackson, teaching him so much. And you can see that in his music as he progressed over time. Michael Jackson is going to become a bigger legend in this book. So I can't wait to get to chapter 3 and share that with you guys. See you next time.